Welcome to Anonymous Stories, where we share stories from around the world. If you are just discovering us, support us by subscribing to this channel and liking this video. Now let's get into the story. I remember it like it was yesterday, the quiet evening that would forever change our lives. My brother, Elton, was a good man. He had a heart as big as the town itself. Known to all, and loved by more than most. He worked at the mechanic shop down on Main Street, fixing cars with an old-world skill that was hard to find nowadays. He also spent his spare time with the kids in the neighborhood, teaching them how to fix bikes and work with their hands, just like he did when he was their age. It was a Wednesday, I think, though, honestly, I lost track of the days after it all happened. That night, there was a protest in town. Folks were upset about something, and they gathered outside the city hall. Tensions were running high, but there were no signs of trouble at first. It was just a peaceful gathering, people raising their voices for what they believed in. But then, everything shifted. Someone, no one knows for sure, threw a bottle, hitting a police officer. It was chaos. People scattered, shouting, and running. In all that confusion, Officer Rebecca Mills, who was at the front of the line, was assaulted. She fell, and that was when everything went south. Now, you have to understand that Elton was never a violent man. He had a temper, sure, but it was never about hurting anyone. He wouldn't harm a fly, not unless it was to protect someone who needed it. But that night, they said they saw him there at the scene of the assault. And that's all it took. I remember the shock in my chest when I first heard the news. My brother? A criminal? It didn't make sense. The officers said his fingerprints were found on a discarded object near the officer, an old beer bottle someone must have dropped. And even though Elton was home earlier that evening, with no clear alibi, it was enough for them to charge him. I couldn't understand it. My brother was a respected man in this town. Why would he be accused of something like this? But the trial, well, that's where everything went wrong. You see, the town was in an uproar. The media painted Elton as the villain, and the people, most of them, believed it. There were rumors, whispers that painted him as the kind of man who would lash out in anger, who would hurt a woman, especially a police officer. And when you're a man of color in a small town like ours, well, the odds are stacked against you. I could see it in the eyes of the jury, some of them couldn't get past the color of his skin. He wasn't given a fair shot. They didn't even look at the facts. There were no witnesses who could definitively place him at the scene. No evidence that pointed to him being the one to harm Officer Mills. But the prejudice in that courtroom, it was thick, and it clouded their judgment. I fought for him, day after day. I went to every hearing, spoke to every lawyer, begged them to see the truth. But the truth didn't matter in that courtroom. The only thing that mattered was the story they wanted to believe. When the verdict came down, guilty of assaulting Officer Mills and sentenced to 7 years in prison, I thought my heart would shatter. 7 years. 7 years of his life, gone. Just like that. It didn't matter that he was innocent. It didn't matter that he had no reason to hurt her. The damage was done, and the system had failed him. I remember the sound of the gavel, the way it echoed in that silent courtroom. It was as if time itself had stopped. Elton's eyes met mine, and I saw the despair in them. I couldn't even comfort him. How could I, when all I wanted was for him to be free? That was the night everything changed. It was hard, watching my brother disappear behind those cold, metal bars. 1 minute, he was out here, a free man, laughing and joking like he always did, and the next, he was gone. They took him away, and with him, a part of my heart went too. I never could have prepared myself for what prison did to Elton. He wasn't the same man who went in. Not that I blamed him. No one would be. When you're locked away in a place like that, where every day is a fight for survival, you either get broken or you learn to harden yourself. And Elton? Well, he learned to harden himself. The stories he told me in his letters. I'll never forget them. He wrote about how the inmates, men twice his size, with criminal histories that would make your blood run cold, saw him as an easy target. They didn't care that he was innocent. They only cared that he had been accused of assaulting an officer. The guards were no better. Some of them were just as bad as the criminals, treating Elton like a punching bag, calling him every name under the sun. There were times I feared for his life. Would I ever see him again? Would the brother I once knew ever come back? Or would prison take everything from him? It wasn't long before I could feel the change in his letters. They started off hopeful, still full of the Elton I remembered, the kind man, the one who used to share stories of the old days with me, the brother who would laugh at the silliest things. But over time, the words became shorter, colder. There were no more jokes. Just a man trying to hold on to what little of himself was left. And what about me? I couldn't just sit back and let my brother disappear into that hell. I wrote to him every week, sent him books, news articles, anything to remind him that the world out here was still thinking of him. But it wasn't easy. The townspeople, they didn't take kindly to me sticking by him. They called me naive, even complicit. They said, "You're just as bad as he is," and it stung. It stung like a slap in the face every time I heard it. But I never stopped believing in him. I couldn't. He was my brother, and I knew in my heart that he didn't deserve this. That was when I met Rachel Bennett. She came into our lives like a breath of fresh air. Rachel was an investigative journalist with a reputation for uncovering the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. I'll never forget the day she called me, out of the blue, asking if I'd be willing to talk to her about Elton's case. I could barely believe it. Someone cared. Someone who wasn't part of the biased system, someone who didn't see him as a criminal, was willing to listen. Rachel was sharp, relentless, and she had a fire in her that reminded me of Elton when he was younger. She dove into the case, uncovering things I never knew, discrepancies in the police report, witnesses who had been intimidated into silence, and a slew of evidence that had been conveniently overlooked during the trial. It was the first time I had hope again. Maybe Elton's story wasn't over after all. Maybe we could still find a way to prove his innocence. As Rachel dug deeper, she uncovered more and more inconsistencies. There were security footage tapes, ones that the defense never got their hands on, that showed Elton wasn't even near the scene of the assault. The fingerprints they had on that discarded bottle. It turned out they weren't his after all. Rachel found out they had been misidentified, a simple clerical error made by the very people who were supposed to be looking out for the truth. But even as the pieces started to fall into place, I could feel the weight of the journey ahead. Would the system allow us to fix its mistakes? Would Elton get a second chance? Or was he just another casualty of a broken system, left to rot behind bars because of a mistake no one cared enough to undo? I wrote to him about Rachel's findings, and he wrote back with a glimmer of hope in his eyes, hope that I hadn't seen in years. It was a small thing, but it was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to make things right. The weight of those years, they never really leave you. But when Rachel called me with the news that day, I didn't know whether to cry, scream, or laugh in disbelief. The truth, it seemed, had been buried so deep, hidden behind lies and fear, but it was finally starting to break free. Rachel had been working day and night, sifting through every detail, every piece of evidence, no matter how small. And just when I thought we were hitting a dead end, she found something that sent chills down my spine. A conspiracy. It turns out, the assault on Officer Mills was not as straightforward as it seemed. In fact, it wasn't even Mills who'd been attacked at all, not in the way everyone believed. No, the real truth was far more twisted. Rachel uncovered that Officer Mills had been assaulted by none other than her own partner, Officer Greg Harris. The two of them had gotten into a heated argument that escalated into violence. Mills, ever the professional, knew that admitting the truth would ruin Harris's career. So, they made a decision that would haunt both of them for years. They concocted the entire story about Elton, planted the evidence near the scene, and fabricated a narrative that led to his arrest. But it didn't end there. The more Rachel dug, the more the lies unraveled. Officer Harris, fearful of being exposed, had used his influence to suppress key evidence and intimidate potential witnesses. But one person, a woman who had been too terrified to speak up all these years, finally found the courage to come forward. Her testimony was clear, powerful, and it shattered the lies that had been built around Elton. She told the truth. She had seen the altercation between Mills and Harris that night. And she knew Elton had been nowhere near the scene. And then, as if the universe itself was finally giving us a break, Rachel discovered something even more damning: video footage. It was from an old security camera located at a nearby store, footage that had been conveniently ignored during Elton's trial. The footage showed Elton walking down the street, completely unaware of what had happened at the protest. It showed him at a completely different location at the time of the assault. He was innocent. He had always been innocent. It was the kind of evidence that no one could ignore. And yet, the road to clearing Elton's name wasn't an easy one. The legal system, so quick to convict him, was now dragging its feet in clearing his name. The prosecutors fought tooth and nail, trying to downplay the evidence, dismissing the witness as unreliable and the video as inconclusive. But Rachel, ever determined, wasn't having any of it. She kept pushing. She fought for Elton and for justice until the courtroom doors couldn't be slammed shut on the truth any longer. And after what felt like an eternity, the day came. The judge, after hearing the full extent of the evidence, after finally seeing the truth laid out in front of him, called for Elton's exoneration. 7 years of pain, of suffering, of lost time, all wiped away with a single word: not guilty. The moment I heard it, I couldn't breathe. I felt this incredible weight lift off my chest. Elton was free. The world was finally seeing what I had known all along, that he had never done anything wrong. I could hear his voice on the phone when he called me to share the news, and I swear, for a moment, I thought I was dreaming. My brother, the man who had been unjustly locked away, was free again. The truth had finally won. But then, reality sank in. The truth had been uncovered, yes, but at what cost? Elton had lost 7 years of his life. 7 years that no amount of justice could bring back. The town, the people who had once looked up to him, saw him as a criminal for so long that even after the truth came out, many didn't know how to look at him. His name had been dragged through the mud. He had been scarred, not just physically but emotionally. And what about the officers involved? Harris and Mills? Well, they were both facing charges of obstruction of justice, false reporting, and worse. The fallout from their actions was going to be messy. But as much as I wanted to see them punished, I couldn't help but feel a heavy sadness. There was no real justice for Elton. Nothing could undo the damage done. When Elton finally came home, he was a different man. He had the same smile, the same gentle spirit, but there was a heaviness in his eyes, a shadow of everything he'd endured. It wasn't the same. It could never be the same. Still, I held on to the hope that one day, we'd find a way to move past it all. To heal. Because, even though the truth had finally been unearthed, it was clear that it was the journey to reclaim his life, his peace, that would take the longest. It's funny, isn't it? You think that when the truth finally comes out, everything will go back to normal. The world will see things as they truly are, and everything will be right again. But that's not how it works. At least, not for Elton. Sure, the trial was over, the charges were dropped, and the system had been forced to acknowledge the wrong it had done. But none of that mattered when Elton walked back into the world. The damage had already been done, and it was far deeper than any of us had anticipated. For months after his release, Elton couldn't find work. Not a single job offered him a chance. How could they? To everyone, he was still a convicted felon, a man with a criminal record that followed him like a shadow, despite the exoneration. People didn't care about the truth. They didn't care that the system had failed him. All they saw was a man who had been accused of assaulting an officer, and that stigma was enough to turn their backs on him. He used to be full of life, he had dreams, aspirations. He'd been the kind of person who'd give anything to help someone in need, to share a laugh with a friend. But now? Now there was a bitterness in his eyes that I had never seen before. Every door slammed in his face, every no from potential employers, it just made him angrier. It made him question everything. Was this what his life had been reduced to? The old friends he'd once helped, the people who had relied on him, none of them were around anymore. They had moved on. They had lives to live, jobs to do, and none of them had time for a man with a criminal record, no matter the truth behind it. It was heartbreaking to see Elton retreat into himself, the man who used to light up a room now silenced by his own demons. As for me, I couldn't just stand by and watch him fall apart. I couldn't. So, I dedicated myself to helping him, to making sure that he didn't slip back into the darkness. But no matter how much I tried to lift him, I could see that there was an ocean of pain inside him, one that I couldn't cross alone. I started looking into programs that could help people like Elton, people who had been wronged by the system, people whose lives were ruined by the very justice that was supposed to protect them. And that's when I found my own calling. I threw myself into advocacy for justice reform. If Elton's story could help even one person avoid the nightmare he had gone through, then it would be worth it. I couldn't undo what had happened to him, but I could fight for change. I could make sure no one else suffered the same fate. But even in the midst of all of this, Elton was changing. Slowly, painfully, he started to open up about his time in prison, the things he had seen, the things he had done just to survive. The trauma that haunted him wouldn't let him go. And yet, in some strange way, it was that very trauma that helped him begin to heal. I remember the first time Elton picked up a paintbrush. It was like watching a part of him come back to life. He started painting, and through his art, he began to tell the story of what he had been through. He painted the harsh, cold walls of the prison, the faces of the men who had tried to break him, the years he had lost, and the anger he had felt. His paintings were raw, unfiltered. They showed the truth of what he had endured, and for the first time in a long time, I saw a glimmer of peace in him. Through his art, Elton began to find meaning in his suffering. It wasn't easy, there were days when the bitterness would take over, when the weight of it all would threaten to drag him under. But little by little, his paintings became a form of therapy. A way for him to speak the words he couldn't say out loud. A way for him to make sense of the pain. It wasn't just the art, though. Elton also started speaking about his experiences in public, at events I organized, telling his story to anyone who would listen. It wasn't easy, standing in front of people, admitting to them the things he had been through. But with each word, I could see him growing stronger, taking back control of the narrative that had once been ripped away from him. The world hadn't been kind to him, but through it all, Elton was finding his way back. It wasn't the same, and it would never be easy, but he was learning to rebuild. He was learning to forgive himself, the system, and even the people who had turned their backs on him. And as for me? I found purpose in my own journey too. Fighting for justice, helping Elton, and speaking out for those who had no voice. I had a reason to wake up every day, a cause that kept me going, even when the road ahead seemed impossibly long. But in the quiet moments, when I saw Elton looking at his paintings all lost in thought, I knew we had both been changed forever. The aftermath of what had happened to him would never truly fade. But maybe, just maybe, with enough time, we could start building something new from the wreckage. Just when it seemed that things might finally be settling into some kind of routine, fate had other plans. Ethan had started to find some semblance of peace. His art was taking off, his advocacy was gaining traction, and little by little, he was learning to live again. But that's the thing about healing, you think you've moved on, and then the past comes crashing back in, reminding you that some wounds are never fully healed. It happened one afternoon when Ethan and I were heading out for a meeting about his next art exhibit. We ran into Officer Mills, of all people, at a cafe. She looked different. Her usual composure was gone, replaced by an air of shame and remorse. The woman who had once been so sure of herself, so confident in her authority, now seemed broken. She approached us hesitantly, almost as if she expected us to push her away. "I never thought I'd see you two again," she said softly, her voice filled with guilt. Ethan froze. I could feel his body stiffen beside me. I didn't know what he was feeling, anger, disbelief, or perhaps both. But I knew this moment was one he'd feared would come. The very person who had played a part in destroying his life, now standing before him, looking as though the weight of the world was on her shoulders. "I don't expect forgiveness," Officer Mills continued, her eyes downcast. "But I owe you an apology, Ethan. I was wrong. Everything I did to you, it was wrong. And it's haunted me every day since." For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. I watched as his face tightened, his fists clenched. It was as if he was fighting with himself, struggling to hold back the torrent of anger and resentment that he'd carried for years. I understood it. I did. But I also knew this was the moment Ethan had to make a choice. Would he let the bitterness consume him forever, or would he take control of his own healing? "Why now?" Ethan finally spoke, his voice raw. "Why come to me after everything?" "I never wanted to ruin your life," Mills said, tears brimming in her eyes. "But I was part of something bigger than I realized. I let fear dictate my actions, and I regret it every day. I had to leave the force. I had to start over. And I just needed to make things right with you. Please understand." Ethan's eyes burned with so much emotion, rage, confusion, sorrow. But then, there was something else. A flicker of understanding. A shift, however small, as if he was realizing that holding on to the anger would only continue to hurt him. He looked away from Mills and turned his gaze to me. I could see the decision forming in his eyes. It wasn't about her. It was about him. It was about finally letting go of the pain that had bound him for so long. "I forgive you," Ethan said, the words heavy but resolute. "Not for you. But for me. I can't carry this anymore." It wasn't a dramatic moment. There were no tears, no grand gestures. It was quiet, intimate. Just the two of them, standing there in the middle of a crowded cafe, as Ethan finally released the weight of the past. Officer Mills nodded, her face filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Ethan. I can never make up for what I did, but I'll carry this weight with me for the rest of my life." She left shortly after that, and Ethan stood there for a long time, just staring after her. I didn't say anything, I just stood by him, knowing that the real healing had begun. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Ethan dove deeper into his work with criminal justice reform. He spoke at rallies, met with lawmakers, and even started mentoring other men and women who had been wrongfully convicted. He didn't do it for recognition, but because he knew it was part of his path to healing. And then, one evening, he stood in front of a crowd at a reform event, sharing his story, his pain, his loss, and his triumphs. His voice was steady, his words powerful, as he used his life as a platform to inspire change. I sat in the audience, my heart swelling with pride. I had watched my brother go through hell and back, and now here he was, standing tall and strong. He had every reason to be bitter, to turn his back on the world, but instead, he was fighting for others, using his voice for good. The injustice he had faced would never disappear. The scars would always remain. But Ethan had chosen to rise above it all. He had found a way to turn his pain into purpose, and in doing so, he had become the man he was always meant to be. As the crowd applauded, I felt a tear slip down my cheek, not from sadness, but from pride. Ethan had fought for his life, for his freedom, and now, he was fighting for the lives of others. And in that moment, I knew we had both found our way, through the darkness, into the light. And as I watched my brother walk off that stage, I realized something: the truth had set him free. But it was his courage and his resilience that would carry him forward, no matter what the world threw at him next. That was his real victory. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Ethan's story. If you were moved by his courage and resilience, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Your support helps us bring more stories that inspire change and spark hope. And remember, if you or someone you know has experienced injustice, you're not alone. Together, we can make a difference. See you in the next chapter.